Good evening, everyone, and hello, Philip. How are you doing today?
I'm great. That intro gets me every time. I still love it. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing good. I wish my computer was cooperating, but at least, my husband had a backup that I could use and steal from him for the at least to get through the show.
Thank you to your husband. It's
Yeah,
probably
otherwise I would have been on my phone.
The solar eclipse probably did something.
I know.
Everyone was waiting for the end of the world from that eclipse, and nothing happened. So
I know.
Off to work we go.
But sadly, my not having a computer is the end of my world.
Oh, that is true. With all you do, you live on your computer with your writing.
So yeah, I'm laughing because it's like, of course I started a new job and I have all these plans to start saving the money, and here I am. We had to fix a tire last week, and now I got to buy a computer with this paycheck. So it's like, go figure.
You're preaching to the choir. Every time I think I'm getting caught up, here comes another vet bill. So
I know. It's really, like, I should just not have gone back to work. I might not have had these problems. But yeah, and actually Bob is making a comment on something that I was going to bring up before we got started. But in case anyone hasn't seen any of our posts, starting in May, Philip and I will still be doing our show every other Wednesday night here. Yeah. But some of our best episodes and some new episodes, and who knows, maybe even some episodes we haven't aired yet, might be coming up. And it's WDJY 99.1.
Yes, FM, Straight Talk Radio. Uh-huh. It's local to Georgia, but you can listen to it on the internet, streaming radio.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. And we will be sharing all of that information as we move forward and we get our training done so we know what we're doing.
Yes, that program looks intimidating. And I'm like, thank you, Heather, for doing this part.
Yeah, once I've been trying to do it, but once I get through this week, I should be good to go because I'm finishing up my training at work. And then I have the final edits for Haunted Florida Roadside Attractions this week.
Oh, very good.
All of those came out at the same time. So, and that's the one that you wrote the forward for.
So. Yes, my writing.
Yep. Can't wait for that to come out. And but yeah, so I actually, before we continue babbling too long and he falls asleep backstage or leaves us, I'm gonna bring our special guest in. Looking forward to today's chat. How are you doing, Loyd?
Good, thanks.
Good. Well, welcome to the show again. Always love having you, and everybody's always asking when you're coming back on. So yes, I'm glad we were able to work it out here.
I'm here.
I know. Yay. Yep. And I would say for those who don't know who you are, but just in case there's someone out there who doesn't know who you are, do you mind giving a little introduction about yourself?
Sure. I'm a 44-year plus, hard to believe, parapsychologist. I've been in the field since the very end of the 1970s. I have specialized in education, but also in investigation, field work, essentially. Mm-hmm. But I've been an educator in parapsychology at the graduate level and adult ed level since 1982, actually. I am currently president of the board of directors of the Rhine Research Center. Mm-hmm. I'm an instructor for the Rhine Education Center. I am president of the Forever Family Foundation, which works with spirit mediums and also supports research on life after death, survival of bodily death. And director of a group called the Office of Paranormal Investigations, which is more of a network than anything else. And it's we're going to be launching a new website actually in about a month or so, kind of to promote nationwide some of the folks that are working with me, and some topics. A lot of the topics we'll talk about tonight as well. Right. Got a lot of books out. I actually just recently republished our second edition of my paranormal casebook. Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah.
It's available on Amazon and Kindle and paperback now. So it's a new edition of the book, and got a whole bunch of other paranormal books out and 2 paranormal mystery novels that I co-authored with a couple buddies. that are out there as well.
Perfect.
And if you haven't taken any of his courses at the Ryan Institute online, you must, because they're amazing. So much value for the money. There's so much additional information you give out that we can download. It was just wonderful, and I have it all on my computer. So
that's good. That's great.
Classes. Yep. That's on my to-do list for this year.
Well, I should also mention, I grew up in the media. My father and uncle were television producer directors, and my uncle, one of my other uncles, was a newscaster for a major radio station in New York. So I've been in and around television and radio since pretty much an early age. In fact, I was currently on TV when I was 6 months old. So.
Oh, wow.
Okay. Well, I don't know about you guys, but I am excited for this presentation that you have. I've been looking forward to this since you and I talked about it. I think we scheduled you for this show a couple months ago.
Yeah, several months ago. Yeah.
Yep. But I'm going to add your slideshow to that. And just to let everybody know before we get started, if you have any questions, we may not get to them right away, but I will star them and we will get to them by the end of the show. So write down your questions, ask them, and kind of looking forward to seeing what you have for us today.
Okay. Absolutely. All right. And just to let folks know, definitely put your questions in the chat. I won't be able to see them because the way this is set up, I can only see my slide. That's it. Otherwise, I can't move them from one to another. So I'm going to talk about this topic. Do ghosts have ESP and other concepts parapsychology can answer, but reality TV cannot? So the answer to the first question is yes, and we'll talk about why here as I go through. So first, I just want to tell you that if you send me an email after this, I'm happy to send you the slides and also a resource guide that I put together for online resources with credible organizations, journals, and a lot more. So make sure this slide will repeat at the end if you haven't jotted down my email address, but feel free to email me, and I'll talk about something else towards the end as well that you can connect with me on. All right, so this is my favorite quote. There's no such thing as a supernatural. There are only things we don't understand yet. I think it's best that this came from a science fiction writer, actually, because in many respects, we're not dealing with horror. We're dealing with science fiction when we talk about speculating about how these things work. And the best of science fiction, I think, in many respects. So I'm a parapsychologist. And what that means is that I'm involved in a field called parapsychology, which is not psychology. It is not paranormal psychology. That actually is a branch or a specialization in the field of psychology looking at people's paranormal beliefs. We do that a little bit, but we're really looking at the experiences and phenomena that people have, which I'll talk specifically about here in a moment. The idea is consciousness, our minds, our consciousness, how it connects with the world around us outside of the use of our normal senses and our physical body. All right. Parapsychology, like psychology, is a social science. It is not a hard science or physical science like physics and chemistry, which is one reason why you can't take an experiment and get the same results over and over again. Psychology can't do it. Neither can any other social science, because we're dealing with human beings and every human being is different. When the field first got started, and even to this day, to some extent, in some parts of the world, it's called psychical research. So in the early days, it was psychical research, and eventually the term parapsychology was applied, especially after J.B. Rhine and William McDougall and Louisa Rhine created a laboratory at Duke University in the 1930s. They started using parapsychology to separate themselves from spiritualism and studies of spirit mediums or physical mediums at the time. But in many respects, it's interchangeable. A psychical researcher or a psi researcher is studying the same things that parapsychologists do. Parapsychology has been around officially since 1882. That was the start of the Society for Psychical Research, the SPR, in the UK. It is still active. In fact, it's more active today than it probably was 15 or 20 years ago. A lot of online stuff you can do. I highly encourage people to join the SPR. They put out a great journal and a magazine. They have activities that are online. So it's really a great organization. And they are looking at things the way that parapsychologists in other parts of the world do in the laboratory, outside the laboratory, quite a bit of people's experiences in real life. The American Society for Psychical Research, which unfortunately is no longer operating, hasn't for years, was founded in 1884, originally in Boston, then in New York. And actually, it was my first job, was working at the ASPR in New York City back in the early 80s. There actually were people doing investigations and scientific work looking at people's psychic experiences before the SPR. In fact, probably the longest running, although how active it's been has not been consistent, I think. The longest running organization is the London Ghost Club, still around, started in the 1860s. And actually, some of the early members of the London Ghost Club included people like Mark Twain and Charles Dickens. So been around for a long time. And they're, like I said, they've still been around. One of their most famous members, who was an author, was Peter Underwood. And I'm really glad to see Peter Underwood's books back out in ebook format and easy to get on Amazon as well. The laboratory work in parapsychology has been going on a little bit early on, when a lot of scientists got involved in psychical research. There was actually really good laboratory research done at Leland Stanford Junior College, published in 1917, before J.B. Rhine really got started with ESP stuff, but some really cool research that's out there. Of course, that's Stanford University nowadays. And like I said, the Duke Parapsychology Lab started in the 1930s. The lab moved off campus when J.B. Rhine retired from Duke in 1965. It became the Institute for Parapsychology and the Foundation for Research on the Nature of Man. And eventually, in the late 1980s, it was renamed, after Rhine died, the Rhine Research Center. So the Rhine Center is the longest running American laboratory doing research, but also providing educational opportunities, library research, a lot of background as well, and a journal. Publishes the official journal of the Parapsychological Association, the Journal of Parapsychology. So one thing that's really important, I hear people, I've talked to a lot of people in the ghost hunting world for the last 25 years, and there seems to be this idea that there's a paranormal field. I'm not quite sure what that means, because parapsychology never seems to be part of that paranormal field. Nor do we get too many people in the ghost hunting world, that community, reaching out to the field of parapsychology. It's not like you can't find us easily. And I'm not even talking about myself. I'm talking about a lot of my colleagues, many of whom didn't even know how active ghost hunters actually were, because nobody has reached out to them. In the meantime, those of us, when I was growing up, interested in parapsychology, interested in the phenomena, which included ghosts and things, I reached out to parapsychologists that I found. This is pre-internet, so I found them through books and magazine articles, and they were always willing to help guide me in terms of educational opportunities and such, and give suggestions. And that's really an important connection that we would like to make in parapsychology. I've been trying to do that for many, many years. Don't always get to do that, unfortunately. I'm glad I'm doing this today. But parapsychology studies people's experiences in the lab and outside the lab from a scientific perspective. We focus on the experience because that's where we're all starting from. We study experiences of extrasensory perception, which is not a sixth sense, by the way. It is perception, which I'll talk about in a moment, without the use of the normal senses. Picking up information without the use of our normal senses. So it's our consciousness, our minds picking up information directly. Psychokinesis, or PK, which includes telekinesis, but that's not the only thing our minds can do with matter and energy. It's, again, without using tools or our hands and such. And we study survival, or evidence for survival, of bodily death, which includes what you see there on the screen: apparitions or ghosts, near-death experiences, reincarnation experiences, mediumship, a lot more than that as well. So here are some general definitions. These are very, very general. We have some more specific definitions that we can talk about. But we use the term apparition, which is a term that was initially used by the psychical researchers, because, frankly, the word ghost has way too much baggage, I guess you could say. I still use it interchangeably with apparition because most people know the word ghost. And I think most people understand or think of the word ghost as someone who's sticking around after death. All right, so that's our idea of an apparition. Its consciousness survives the death of the body. It can interact with the physical world. That's apparitions of the dead. There are actually apparitions of living people also that do show up in the caseload and have been around studied since the 1880s. In fact, there's a great book, if you want to see some really interesting experiences, that is available for free on the Internet Archive, which is archive.org. Also been reprinted. You can find it on Amazon, called Phantasms of the Living. Really great experiences there. Apparitions can be seen, heard, felt, smelled, sensed. There's a lot of different ways we experience them, but that doesn't mean our normal senses are involved. Hauntings, which most people, I think, in the ghost hunting world will call a residual haunting, is an experience of information, an information residue that is imprinted. Think of it as recorded in the environment, possibly in an object. And it is a recording of the activity of the living, not the dead. It is no more a recording of the dead than the movie The Maltese Falcon is a recording of the dead. In other words, The Maltese Falcon, made many, many decades ago with Humphrey Bogart. Bogart's been dead a long time. I can still watch that movie, but he was alive when he made the movie. So the recording, the residue we call a haunting, was created when the people in that recording were alive, not after they died. We don't find cases of apparitions leaving that kind of recording behind. And then we have the term poltergeist, which is a little controversial in many respects because people often want to use the literal translation of that word, which means noisy ghost, and people call it a mischievous ghost. That was the original use of the term in 16th century Germany. We had some German historians that traced it back at least that far. And by the way, the word ghost hunter and ghost hunting, a folklorist by the name of Timothy Prasil, his books I really recommend, Prasil. He has so far traced the word ghost hunting back to the late 1700s. So it's not a new term at all. Poltergeist was used as a term to define a certain type of what people thought was supernatural activity caused by a spirit, because they had no other possible way of describing it. There was stuff moving around, physical activity, sometimes raps and bangs on the walls, sometimes other kinds of physical sounds, not the same as apparitions. These were physical sounds that everybody could hear. They could see things moving. There wasn't a situation like with an apparition where only some people saw it. It was physical, and these are physical activity points. This is purely physical activity. It does typically revolve around one person, mostly with pent-up stress or psychological issues. In a small percentage of cases, it seems to relate to activity in the temporal lobe of the brain, like epilepsy. The activity is, think of it as a telekinetic temper tantrum or stress relief valve for people. That's a living agent as a person. Now, there are instances where the apparitions seeming to move objects, we would call that an apparition case, and the apparition can move stuff. That's apparitional PK, not the same with a poltergeist case. When we talk about any of these phenomena, really, we have to always start from the point of the difference between the senses and perception, because there's a difference. There's the statement in the New Age, people talk about creating your own reality. We actually do, because the way we all see the world, experience the world, is individual based on our perceptions. And our perceptions use our senses for the most part. So using the physical senses, we have physical organs like eyes and ears. We collect information, data from the environment, our experience. But there are physical structures in the brain specifically oriented to giving signals to the brain as to what's going on, visually, auditorily. Our skin is our biggest sensor. So actually our skin is our biggest sense, or that's a sense of touch, but it also includes there's nerve endings for sense of pressure, texture, pain, hot and cold, all sorts of sensors there. So it's more than one sense in many respects. And so we actually have more than those 5 sensory groups. In fact, the sixth sense, if you just want to count touch as one sense, the sixth sense is our sense of balance. I got a structure in my inner ears. that helps me orient myself, keeps my balance. That sends signals to my brain. That's a sense. That's a sensory organ. So that is a sense. And there are other senses that there's debate about that human beings have that we know some animals might have, that do have, in fact. Sensing electromagnetic fields, something that pigeons and sharks and other animals navigate by sensing geomagnetic fields and other electromagnetic fields. Humans may have some form of that sense as well. Some people have been able to develop sonar, like a bat's sonar, to actually kind of create that sense in themselves. There are a number of other ways that folks in the research area of the senses and perception look at all this, but that's all the information coming in. That's like my webcam. All right, the webcam sends my voice and my picture into the computer. The computer makes sense of them, which then gives a picture. That's what your perception does. Your perceptual process takes that information from normal sensory data and creates an image in your head. And the idea of sound, what you hear, what you smell, all of those things, that's perception. And our normal senses actually sometimes pick up much more than we're paying attention to or attending to. That doesn't mean you're seeing in the infrared or ultraviolet or anything like that. We know the limitation of human hearing, although some people can hear a little bit beyond in the upper range and some people can hear a little bit in the lower range. There are people who can hear a dog whistle. Not a lot, but there are some people who can hear that. So there's a range of perception for any of the senses. Some people are really good smellers. That's a chemical sense. There are super tasters, and we actually have 5 senses of taste on our tongue. That's out at this point, maybe a 6th. All of those things give us an image of the world that we make sense of. But that's all impacted by how we learn to perceive the world, how we learn to process, how we program ourselves, how the environment programs ourselves, how our family programs us, our beliefs, our biases, all of that programs how you put it all together. Some optical illusions work based on that programming. Others work on optical principles. So there's a lot of things that are at play with perception. And one of the things that play with perception is extrasensory perception or non-sensory perception. Perception by consciousness without the use of the senses, giving you more information about the world around you, added to the sensory perceptions, but it still goes through the process. So it seems like you're seeing something. It seems like you're hearing something. It seems like you're smelling something. You perceive something visually, auditorily, and so on. But that doesn't mean that your eye is seeing it, your ears are hearing it, your nose is smelling it, and so on. Think of those as almost like hallucinations, but they have an outside source in that respect. So why am I asking, do ghosts have ESP as the start of this? I said yes right off the beginning. Well, there's a really good reason. And this speaks to one reason why anyone who does investigations or research looking at apparition experiences, so ghosts, hauntings, poltergeists, should know something about extrasensory perception and psychokinesis and even the evidence for life after death. In other words, investigators should know something about parapsychology and what we have found in the last 140 plus years, what we've learned from the laboratory, what we've learned from studying people's experiences outside the laboratory. And the reason why is questions. All right. How do ghosts perceive the world since they don't have physical senses? How can a ghost see you? Because a ghost doesn't have eyes, physical eyes. There's no retina for the light to go into the eye and hit the retina and send signals anywhere, because a ghost is without a body. No physical senses. How can they hear you? How can they smell you? How can they do anything? How can they speak if they don't have a voice box? I'm speaking and my larynx is vibrating. So my vocal cords are vibrating and moving the air. They're actually creating sound. That's why you can't make any sound in space, because it's a vacuum. How do ghosts interact with us at all if they don't have a physical body? How do they move things with no body? How could they possibly show up on photos if they don't have an actual body to reflect light or give off light. And most importantly, the question I always had since I was a kid, watching old ghost shows, where do they get their clothes from? And also, why do many ghosts who are seen apparitions shortly after people's death? So if somebody dies, let's say your Uncle Harry dies, he was 92 years old, he was sickly, and he shows up within a couple of hours after he dies, maybe at the moment of death, maybe a couple of days later, and you and other family members see him, and he looks like he's 30 or 35, and he's wearing fully dressed, even though he died in a hospice, and he certainly wasn't dressed then. Where do those clothes come from? How come he's younger? How come he doesn't look sick anymore? And I'm saying all that because the vast majority of reported ghostly experiences the world over, the apparition doesn't look necessarily, unless of course they died when they were 30, they look much younger than they were when they died. They look, if they were died in, let's say, a tragic accident, they don't show the damage that they had when they died, unlike the movie The Sixth Sense. They might have actually spiffed up their clothes. They might have lost a little weight, so there's a lot of differences, but people recognize them as that relative, as that friend, as that loved one. Where do they get their clothes from? Well, we have ruminated on this for a long time, and some of the early researchers actually came up with a model that works for us. First, how could they possibly perceive the world without physical senses? Well, the answer is, since we living people have non-sensory perception, extrasensory perception, it makes sense that once the senses go away, that's how you would perceive the world. They could interact. By definition, mind over matter means a mind affects matter, or the material world could also be energy. That's psychokinesis. Well, an apparition still has a mind. So there's that interaction. And how they could show up on film on EVP. And the thing about EVP, it's really important to remember, is that effectively is defined as electronic voice phenomena, not voice phenomena, electronic voice phenomena, because the voice appears in the recording medium, or basically in the recorder directly. You do not need a microphone at all to pick up EVP, if it's truly EVP. In fact, that's one way to make sure it is EVP in that way. And the model for electronic voice phenomena has been the apparition, the ghost, the spirit, uses their mind over matter ability, PK, to affect the device, to affect the recording medium, to affect the film, to affect the video, to alter it so that they appear, if that happens at all. And then about us seeing them or perceiving them, we get a signal, because we can't see them with our eyes. They're not optical phenomena. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. But we get a signal from them about themselves. Our own psychic ability picks up, and everybody's got a little bit. You may not think you're psychic, but you got a little bit going on. It's a little different for people who call themselves psychics, but we all have a little bit of perception happening all the time using ESP. So we get perceptions of them, which is their ESP and our own ESP. So the clothing thing. If you would, for a moment, as an experiment, close your eyes and picture yourself. Now, I know that not everyone can visualize. We're actually doing a study at the Rhine Center on aphantasia, which are people who can't visualize. So I'm sorry if that's the case. But if you can get a picture of yourself, think of yourself. All right. And then open your eyes. Because number one, there's nothing in science, neuroscience or anything else, that explains how you could even picture yourself. There's no explanation for visualization yet, because we don't understand consciousness. But number two, I'm assuming you didn't picture yourself naked. There's that kind of a stereotype that older guys always think of themselves as 30. It's true. We don't like to think we're getting older. So even my self-image is of myself younger. I still was bald back then. I know that when I become a ghost, I'll probably add a little hair to that picture. But I certainly wasn't as gray as I am right now. How we look as apparitions is based on that individual self-image, that consciousness is self-image. And since it's extremely rare in Western culture for someone to imagine themselves naked, then we don't get naked reports of ghosts that are naked. Another interesting thing is that many reports of apparitions, when people look at that apparition, they're only perceived, if they're perceived visually at all, the witness says, I saw them all the way down to their knees. And there's a lot of descriptive information that says that they didn't see the feet of that apparition. Most people, at least, I haven't done a really official survey, but I used to do a lot of college lectures back in the 90s and early 2000s, and sometimes for huge groups of college students. And when I asked this question, you imagined yourself, you pictured yourself, did you see your feet? And what I found was universally about 5% did, but only about 5%. And in that 5%, when I did the second question, I found that most of the people were either fashion conscious about their shoes or there was something going on with their feet. So they did imagine that as part of their self-image as well. So how we look after death is up to us, not on some form of ectoplasm or something else that's out there. So what's going on here? Well, with apparitions, we perceive them. We don't see them. We perceive them, maybe visually. Maybe we hear their voice. Maybe we sense their presence. Maybe we feel a physical touch, even though it's not a physical touch. We perceive. We have perceptions in those ranges in some fashion. It can be that sometimes the environment might alter. That's where your technology might come in. Things might appear on photos and on audio recordings, and sometimes things might move. That's all about psychokinesis, theoretically of the apparition, but actually a lot of that could be us, the living, as well. So is that psychokinesis on the part of the apparition? Could it be that the apparition is working with our own ESP and PK? Kind of we're acting as a medium, even though we don't know we are, and helping it along? Or could we be creating some of those effects because we really, really want those things to happen? So we first have to eliminate, this is the one big difference that happens in parapsychology, is right off the bat, we look at every single event that is reported in a case and we separate them all. Altogether, they may seem like this is an incredibly active case. But when we look at individual reported movements or experiences, we often find that for individual events that are reported or individual experiences in the overall case, there may be normal explanations. Sometimes it's just as simple as people making an assumption or being on edge, and they think because they're on edge, they're a little afraid because they did have an actual experience with an apparition. Now anything that happens in their house suddenly becomes part of that paranormal thing. There was actually a survey done in 2021 by a real estate company, and they found that as a result of the lockdown during the pandemic, there was an incredible increase of people thinking their houses were haunted. And there was an age difference. They did kind of break it down also by age. And apparently the older you were, the less likely you were to think your house was haunted. The younger you were, the more likely you were to think that. And what was reported as why they thought that were mostly sounds and occasional things that fell off a table or a wall, like a picture falling from a wall, things like that, but mostly unusual noises. Houses and apartment buildings make noises. Older people have lived in them long enough to know that. But the thing about that the real estate company noted was that this was the first time that many people had been locked in their homes for 24 hours a day with not much to do necessarily, outside the house, certainly nothing to do. And they're noticing things for the first time. So we have to go through, like the realtors did, and understand what the individual events are. And we find that even in the most active cases, we can find some things that have an explanation. That does not mean that people are gullible. It does not mean that the witnesses are stupid. It means that they have had some experience emotionally, or that they have talked themselves into being afraid for whatever reason, or they're just so interested in the paranormal that they want things to happen, that they mislabel things. They come to wrong conclusions. In order to study these things, we must eliminate all those other things first. So how do ESP and PK relate to apparitions? Well, apparitions interact with the world and us using ESP. They occasionally learn to move things, apparently. Most apparition experiences don't have anything physical happening. There are some longer-term situations with apparitions where after several months, things start moving. And sometimes after years, things start moving a lot because the apparition has learned to do that. For a film example of that, I would suggest you watch the 1990 movie Ghost with Patrick Swayze and Demi Moore. There's a really good scene in there where Patrick Swayze's ghost character, Sam, consults with another ghost on the New York subway on how to move things. And it's a pretty good explanation of the whole thing. It's for us looking at, of course, we perceive the ghosts in different ways using ESP. It's very clear from looking at the research, from looking at the hundreds of thousands of reports from all over the world, that apparitions are not optical or acoustical, because we have many cases where there could be several people around in the place where the apparition is appearing, and one person sees the ghost, someone else hears the ghost talking, someone else senses the presence or smells something, but there's a bunch of people who don't experience anything. And the human eye, there's not any, we know a lot about the eye and how it works and what wavelengths of light it picks up and all of that. There's no explanation from a physics perspective that an apparition actually has optical presence, none whatsoever. If they were making an actual sound, you wouldn't need EVP. You could record it with anything. And we do know that there's not physical sound being produced in that way. All right. So again, if apparitions had that kind of presence, everyone would see them, everyone would hear them. They could easily be recorded or photographed every time someone heard a ghostly voice, saw an apparition, and this clearly is not the case. It is so much more likely that it's an apparitional effect on the device. The apparition intends to do something. So as far as hauntings go, if we talk about residual hauntings, if there's information in the environment that we're all picking up, we're picking it up psychically. We're picking it up with ESP. There's an alternative, which I'll get to in a moment. So first question we have in terms of research is, does the environment record and hold information? Well, all the haunting experiences seem to indicate that that is the case. The question is how, and we're still trying to figure that out. So if so, if there is information in objects in the environment, we pick that up, we perceive that either through ESP, clairvoyance, which means real-time ESP. It does not just mean seeing things. Psychometry is an ability that many psychics talk about. It's actually a really interesting thing that almost anybody can learn. It's fascinating. I teach a course, which I'll talk a little bit more about at the end here, for the Ryan Education Center, which is coming up in mid-May. One of the exercises we go through is a psychometry exercise. It's not hard to learn. And it's just holding or touching an object and picking up information from it about the owner, about where it's been. There's some really good examples of that in the history of not only parapsychology, but even archaeology that's out there. So it's either a form of psychic ability to pick, or psychic perception to pick up the information that the object might hold. And let's face it, a house is a big object. So instead of holding the object, you're in the object. Or, and this is an alternative model as well, this could be an interaction of the mind, the brain, and some physical holder of information. So let's assume for a moment that the Earth's magnetic field, or something about magnetic fields in the environment, holds information, kind of like magnetic tape holds information or records information, or a flash drive, magnetic, it's magnetic media in that sense. All right. So then we have a physical possibility where the brain picks up this information because the brain is interacting with those magnetic fields. We seem to find the best correlation with geomagnetic fields, but unlike apparition cases, one of the more consistent connections or correlations, And the reason why ghost hunters are even using EMF meters is because we have found in many cases of residual hauntings a connection between higher than background magnetic fields in the spot that the replay happens, as opposed to areas around that replay or anywhere else in the building. So there is a connection that it's not 100%, but it's fairly correlative. It does not mean that EMF meter is picking up a haunting. We're not exactly sure why that field is even coming through, but there are other reasons why that meter could actually react, which we always have to eliminate first. There's many, many other possible reasons we have to get rid of first. It's still very interesting that even if we find that the high field is next to, let's say, a circuit breaker, if that's the spot that people are experiencing something, there still seems to be a connection between the electromagnetic field and that person's experience. So interesting things there. Maybe a physical thing, not a psychic thing at all. Some of us have been talking about some experiments to test that, but we're not quite there yet. So how does PK relate to poltergeist? Well, you don't have a poltergeist case unless there's psychokinesis involved. All right. Even if you believe that a poltergeist is a spirit, it's still a spirit doing PK, because by definition, it's mind over matter, even if it's a dead guy, dead mind. So psychokinesis is direct effect on the physical world by consciousness, living or dead. But since the early 20th century, there was a researcher, investigator, and I suggest you look him up, by the name of Nandor Fodor. There was a recent Simon Pegg movie based on a case that he investigated, which was it's still a very controversial case, supposedly about a talking mongoose. Fodor, I don't think, having read and looked into Fodor quite a bit, Simon Pegg's character did not do justice to actual Nandor Fodor. He was a psychoanalyst, before that a lawyer, and he wrote some incredible stuff on poltergeist cases, on apparition cases. He was a real good investigator. He actually suggested that poltergeist cases seem to have a living person at the center of them all the time, at least the ones he looked at, and also the ones that Herwood Carrington, who he worked with, also looked at. William G. Roll, who wrote a book called The Poltergeist, which is available on Amazon. I encourage you to read it. It's like the book on poltergeists. Bill Roll and J.G. Pratt, at a case on Long Island in 1958, determined that it was a young boy in the case who was causing all the activity, or at the center of all the activity. And when he is removed from the case, nothing happens. When he's put back into the family setting, stuff would happen. And this is the situation with all of our cases that we call poltergeists. There's either an individual that this centers around, or on occasion, what you end up having is a family setting. So if certain members of the family are always around together, then you have the activity. Even in those cases, we seem to think it's still one of the individuals that's causing it unconsciously. It's just the triggers are the other family members that are there. This can also happen in a workplace, for that matter. So this has been long established in our field, that we're dealing with if it's purely physical activity, if there are no apparitions seen. I've taken psychics and mediums into poltergeist cases, and they don't pick up anything in the way of spirits, even when physical things are happening. Except that sometimes a couple of the folks I've worked with have been able to determine almost immediately what's going on with the poltergeist agent. The stereotype is a teenage girl. That stereotype is a stereotype. It is not actually accurate. We have probably about 60% of the cases tend to be adolescents. So that could be like someone as young as maybe 10 years old and as old as early 20s. It's not just teenagers. It's not just related to puberty, though that can play into it. And I had a poltergeist case where the agent was 80. So it can happen throughout a person's life. We all often experience mini poltergeist events. One of my students told me that she was under real stress because she was doing her final quiz for one of the classes that I just finished teaching. And for whatever reason, she lost everything. In other words, she thought she submitted it on our platform, on the online platform, but she didn't. So now she had to redo it. And so she started redoing it in Word, and then she apparently either hit the wrong button or something, but the computer shut down. And when it booted back up, the document was there, but it was unreadable. And this was all because she was so stressed out. I've had that kind of experience myself, being really frustrated, and one of my devices acting up. It's kind of a poltergeist event in some respects. We call all this, though, recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis, because it is happening again and again. It's spontaneous because it's not under conscious control. So if an apparition was doing it, we call it apparitional PK. It might be recurrent psychokinesis, but it's not spontaneous if there's intention involved. Plus the fact that poltergeist activity, RSPK, is chaotic. It's chaos. That's why you hear about destruction, things breaking, things flying, stuff like that. And while that could happen with specific apparition cases, apparitional activity, when it's physical, tends to be very, very purposeful and rarely destructive. I will add that sometimes if you ignore a ghost or yell at them, you might get some destructive thing if the ghost stuff happening, if the ghost is not liking what you're doing. Okay, now let's talk about technology for a moment. First, over the years, I've seen so many people claim that they're doing scientific investigations on their websites or presentations. And looking into their website and what they're doing, their methodology, or watching the presentation, it's pretty clear they don't know what that means. In fact, it's pretty clear that many people say that they're doing something scientifically because they're using a technological device, an EMF sensors, some other sensor of some kind. That does not mean you're doing science. That does not mean you're being scientific any more than if you cook something with your microwave. That doesn't make you a scientific chef. Fact is that using technology of any kind, and the word technology also refers to any kind of tool, man-made tool. So that also goes back to stone knives and spearheads and arrowheads. All of that stuff is technology. A club is a bit of technology. Chimpanzees, by the way, strip a stick just strip it down to a single stick, and they have been observed sticking that stick into a termite mound and pulling out termites on the stick and eating them. They made a tool to help them get their food. That's technology. So chimps use technology. We're talking about high tech or electronic tech for the most part, and for the most part, environmental sensors. Using sensors incorrectly or using them just to use them is not scientific. Using them to gather information, data, and to make sense of the data, to pull the data together, to connect it to everything in the case, to analyze that data, that is a scientific process that you can call scientific. But using tech doesn't mean it's scientific. I will say that certainly far from every investigation I do, for a very good reason, I'll get to the ethics here in a bit, is scientific in this way. It's not always about, in fact, very, very often it's not about gathering data. It's about helping the people. So you can still do an investigation and then apply science. It doesn't make the investigation scientific, but it does mean you can say that I'm using applied science. So what applied science means is you're using the application of scientific principles and findings and knowledge to make sense of what's going on. So for example, applying science to an EMF meter, you're using that meter to find a baseline of what's the normal EMF readings in this house. What are the things in the house that might set that EMF meter off, which could be wiring. I've absolutely found more bad wiring and issues with appliances and other things than I've ever found a connection with apparitions or hauntings with an EMF meter. Right. So I'm applying the knowledge about EMF meters. And one of the ways you get that is by reading the instructions. I've seen things on TV, honestly, that make me shake my head very clearly. And I'm guessing it's not necessarily because the people using the devices don't know how to use them properly, but more likely the producers want them to use it in a certain way. We're going to get into the reality TV thing here in a bit. So if you know about science, if you know physics, if you know engineering, if you know psychology, you can apply those sciences to your investigations. And that helps with at least talking about it being within the science. So all investigations you shouldn't claim that all your investigations are scientific, unless all you're trying to do is gather data, analyze it, and compare it against the experiences and come to some conclusion. There are some ethical considerations about that. But again, all of your investigations could be applied science, meaning you should know something about parapsychology. But when it comes right down to it, this is something that really bothers a lot of us in the field. Witnesses are, in fact, the most important part of any investigation. And I've seen, of course, TV shows, some of the groups on some of the shows, they send the witnesses away during the investigation. And I know that ghost hunting groups often follow particular methodologies on the TV shows. And I've gotten calls from people who were sent out of their house, and the next morning they came back from the hotel where they had to stay, and the investigators stayed overnight in the house and gathered their evidence and then gave a reveal, went over the evidence, gave the reveal, and told them, yes, your house is haunted, and that was it. I've had cases where the folks have called me or called someone else in our field and said, we thought we were getting help. We asked for help. We thought there was something bad in our house. And we get a call from the lead investigator at 3:00 in the morning at the hotel. They said, we're out of the house. We're never coming back. We got an EVP of a growl. You have a demon. And they leave the people alone. That's ignoring the witness experience. That's ignoring the fact that the witnesses may have a connection. That's making a bad judgment call. We're going to get to some of that in a bit. The fact is that you would not have anything to investigate without a human being having an experience. If you are just going to spooky places to see if you get anything on your tech, you are not doing a proper investigation. You're certainly not, you are ghost hunting in that way. You're looking for a ghost in that way. And if you get EVP in that place, there's no guarantee that came from a ghost that's resident in the place. The fact is, apparitions can go anywhere. We sometimes stick ourselves once we're dead. We apparently sometimes think that we can't go anywhere, but it's really clear, again, from people's experiences, from the data we have, that apparitions are not locked into a place, and certainly not where they died. It's where they lived, where they worked. That's where they typically go. But without witnesses, you don't have a case. You don't have a ghost story. You have nothing to start with. You need to have witnesses or people who have had experiences, and you need to talk to them. Now, granted, I kept on hearing on ghost hunters, for example, well, we ignore the witnesses because that's anecdotal evidence. And then the shows include a team talking to one person in this public place who tells them about all the phenomena. Well, isn't that anecdotal evidence? If it was written down, the person's reading it from something that was written down. Whoever wrote that down, isn't that anecdotal evidence? Again, we're dealing with human beings, living and dead. Consequently, it's all experience. We're dealing with understanding human experiences of ghosts, of poltergeist phenomena, of hauntings. Apparitions are ghosts too. Ghosts are people too. They're dead, but they're still people. So you can't ignore the witnesses, and yet that's what some of the shows do. But there are reasons for that we'll get to. Why the reality shows ignore that. In actuality, forget all your tools and tech. The best tech involves people, all right? Because all that equipment can do is pick up things in the environment. And there are many devices that are questionable, very questionable, that folks in and around our field have taken apart and raised serious questions about what they're actually doing. There are many devices marketed to ghost hunters that may actually put the ghost in the device. I don't know if you've ever played with the Ghost Radar app. which is there's a free version of the paid version. I've had people tell me that they think there's a ghost in the house because the ghost radar app says there's a spirit present. The app just creates ghosts, just like the ghost camera apps allows you to put a ghost in your picture as you're taking it or right afterwards. It doesn't do that. We define apparitions as the experience of something. We define hauntings as the experience of something. Poltergeist phenomena requires people witnessing things happening or at least seeing the aftermath. Even an investigator who is experiencing something, that's anecdotal evidence. I'm sorry, if you're going to ignore the witnesses, you should ignore your own experiences too. So what the equipment can do is support the perceptions and experiences of people. So if I'm getting unusual environmental readings, when someone is having an experience of seeing an apparition or a haunting, that tells me something. There's a connection there. I may not know exactly what that connection is, but there's a connection there. And that says that they're really experiencing something that has an environmental impact. That's as far as we can go at this point. Because without the perceptions, what the experiences happen to be, we don't know what those readings mean. Okay, so I get a high EMF reading. I got a high EMF. That's it. Oh, I also got a temperature change. Okay, that's in the environment. I can't connect that to phenomena unless a human being tells me that they're seeing a ghost or experiencing something. You know, you can, of course, people do ask equipment questions and hope that the ghosts are using that to communicate, but we don't really know whether that's going on. So we defined these experiences, apparitions, hauntings, and poltergeists, based on perceptions and observations of people having those experiences and perceptions. We know that psi, that's the term we use for ESP and psychokinesis, is involved in the communication process. When a medium communicates with a spirit or a human being has an experience of an apparition, that is an ESP experience. That is ESP, non-sensory communication, non-sensory perception. It's all in the interaction process. It's all person-centered. The whole world could be haunted, but unless somebody has an experience, there's no way you could label that. So we have in our field been using psychics and mediums. Individuals have been using psychics and mediums in cases going all the way back. Sometimes the investigations were looking at the psychics and mediums, especially during the heyday of seances in the late 1800s and the first quarter of the 20th century. Especially physical medium. There are many, many phonies. And frankly, there are many phonies out there calling themselves psychics or mediums. Many who think they are. As president of the Forever Family Foundation, one of the things we've learned is that sometimes people think they're a medium because they've been watching the TV shows. They see their dead Uncle Harry once just after he dies. And we have a certification program which allows us to scientifically test potential mediums, and then once they pass the test, and it's only about 1 in 10, actually I think it's about 1 in 100 actually, now they think about it, that pass the tests that we have. We put them on, we use them, we work with them as certified evidential mediums. People call up and want to be tested, and their only criteria for being tested is they saw a ghost once. That's not a medium. That's a normal human being who had an experience. Calling yourself a psychic or medium is like calling yourself an artist or musician. You have some degree of control. You can bring up that ability. You can use that ability. And they can be used, good ones can be used in making assessments of what's going on from a psychic or paranormal perspective. If it's an apparition, they can communicate, and communication is the key in these cases. Who are you? What are you doing here? Do you need anything from us? And they can be very diplomatic, kind of helping deal with situations where the apparition thinks it's still my house. I don't care that you're living in my house. I built this house. I want you out of my house. And we hear that once in a while. It's pretty rare, but we do hear it. And the psychic and medium can kind of help in those cases too. They also very much help with the living who are distraught. When we look at psychics and mediums, choosing them, we consider how useful their information is, because even the best psychic may not provide useful information in a particular case or in cases in general. So how useful is the information in general? How useful is the practitioner as a person in the investigation process? And that means they're not divas. They don't get in the way of interviewing witnesses. They don't, make sure that they're the center of attention. I've had people want to come on. I've tested them in the field. Sometimes they're getting great information, but the moment my attention leaves them, they start acting up. Oh, I'm getting something. Yeah, that's not useful. Can you question them? Somebody says, I'm picking up something. Okay, is that related to this case? Is it something you're picking up from somewhere else? You have to ask questions sometimes to pin down what that information has to do with the situation you're investigating. And then they should know their strengths and strengths and weaknesses. In other words, what are they best at and what are they worst at? How do they do in cases if it was a poltergeist case? Can they read people also, looking for stress? How do they do in haunting cases, residual hauntings versus that? Do they know the difference between a residual haunting figure they've seen and an apparition that might be there communicating? Because there is a difference. It's recording versus consciousness. Or is it live or is it Memorex? For those who are old enough to remember that. How are they any good in picking up normal explanations for things? I've worked with psychics who were incredibly good because their other background, their lives did not revolve about just being psychics. They had real lives too, otherwise. And then, can they pick up fraud? Of course, are they frauds? That's a whole different question. The best psychics and mediums are confident without being egotistical. No divas need apply. You can question them about their perceptions. In fact, they're interested in learning and they want to know whether they're right. So they should want to please, basically. They should have a good sense of humor about themselves when it comes to the situation. In other words, they don't take themselves too seriously. They can take their subject matter seriously. It's often what I talk about. I take the subject seriously. I work seriously, but a little humor goes a long way. Even being lighthearted in investigations actually gets me more phenomena happening, especially with apparitions, than being overly serious. Kind of like studies that have been done in laboratories with psychology experimenters. The folks who are ultra serious in white lab coats don't get as good results from their participants as the really friendly grad student who's kidding around with the participants. So it works the same way. People skills, good people skills. All right, so we started using measuring devices and sensing tools and technology in different ways. In the early days, in England, especially in some of the older buildings, they would use tape measures and other devices to measure the space to make sure there wasn't a hidden passageway or hidden room. Trying to get a sense of the environment was very important. So when photography came in, taking pictures of the actual environment was important. Early on, they had, in the early 20th century, folks started looking to see if there was anything about the paranormal activity that would disturb a compass, a compass needle. If objects were seen to move or seen after the fact moving, they would sometimes put chalk dust or draw a line around a lamp or something was on a table because people said that the lamp would always move. And this way they could see after the fact that it actually moved out of the circle. They tried putting, some of the early investigators, because people were hearing footsteps, try putting chalk dust or talcum powder on the floor to see if the footprints would appear. And that only works with the invisible man. So it doesn't really work with the ghost because there's no feet involved. And then eventually, as other tools, recording devices for sound recording became available, EVP really got started in the 40s and 50s, more into the 1960s. Tony Cornell, one of our luminaries on the British side of the world, who spent over 50 years doing investigations, back in the 60s, working with some other folks, created a suitcase-like device, which had a chart recorder, EMF sensor, thermometer, barometer, all sorts of stuff in it. And it put all the data together on the chart recorder. Didn't really end up being very useful in certain cases, but it was an attempt. And of course, we're able to do that in much smaller devices now. I'm waiting for somebody to really invent a true tricorder like on Star Trek to pull everything together. There are some things that have multiple levels or different types of things. most important today, you really should be using devices you know about, not designed for ghost hunters, and you should read the instructions. The EMF meter that I've got right now had a 50-page instruction manual because it not only logs the data that I can download to my computer, but it creates analytics, little charts and things that I can look at. The problem here is we have no technology, and you can't develop technology to detect something unless you know what it might be made of or what it's doing. There's literally no consistency in apparition cases with any sensor device, with anything at all. With hauntings, we have that one correlation to higher than background EMF. That's about it. That's really all we got at this point. And in poltergeist cases, we have nothing at all, unless the physical environment's being manipulated in some way directly by PK. So we really have nothing here. How do you develop an AM radio when all you know about is FM? That's all you know is out there for radio. So you can't develop something unless you have some idea of what it might be made of. I recently saw or heard a presentation when I was up at the Oregon Ghost Conference. Some guy was talking about ghosts being subatomic in nature. And one of the things he said was that orbs were created because a stray quantum particle in the air reflected the light from the camera, the flash from the camera. Particle being related to the ghost. Problem with that is quantum particles are smaller than photons. Can't reflect light. And there won't be, I mean, there aren't stray particles necessarily. You need a bubble cloud chamber to even detect that, a quantum particle, because they're so tiny in physics. So making assumptions like that will get you a lot of pseudoscientific technobabble, and possibly allow you to sell things to ghost hunters, but it doesn't really work. So, we get cases coming in. Do we turn them down? The answer is sometimes. It really depends on the parapsychological investigator. I mean, honestly, one of the reasons why I'm kind of working with someone to create a new website for the Office of Paranormal Investigations is I have had a lot of students who have gone through the field investigations classes at the Rhine Center, and we really want to create a network that is available to everyone in the world to find someone in their area. And so once we have the network up, the website up, then I'll be starting to add some of my former students who have filled out a survey explaining where they are, how far they'll travel, what kinds of cases they like, what they won't do, things like that. We turn down investigations because they're too far away. I have a case over, close about 200 miles from here. It's very active. Love to go there. I don't have time to travel there, and there's no one in the area. So I'm hoping that one of my other folks who lives a little closer to that might be available to do an investigation. So we do try to find other folks, or we try to handle them virtually, which we can now do to some extent. There's some elements you can't really do virtually, especially when you're dealing with apparitions. You really need someone to be on site to look for that. Also, I've turned down, and we have turned down investigations because the people are absolutely positive it's demonic. And no matter what you tell them, the scientific approach does not involve demons. In addition, we always talk to folks about the fact that we're going to go in and try to figure out what's normal, what has an explanation and what does not. Are you open to hearing the normal explanations if that's all we find? And if they say no, if there's some issues with that, then it's not going to really help. It's going to be a difficult investigation. So we may have to turn them down. And the last reason I often there's also psychological reasons we might turn them down, because really there's something psychological going on that we note. All of this is done, by the way, with a pre-interview on the phone or on Zoom, because you can't get it it doesn't really work with email. The last one, people actually say to me sometimes, so do you think our case is good enough to be turned into a movie? In other words, they want media attention. That's not what we're going for. They either want our help or not. The term debunking became very popular in ghost hunting communities thanks to a couple of the TV shows. But debunking, look at the word debunk. That means it's based on bunk or bunkum, which is fakery, fraud, lies, con artistry. So debunking means piercing through the veil of lies, finding phony psychics, people who are lying about their experiences. That's not what you're doing. On occasion, I've been asked to investigate a few psychics here and there who turned, and I did debunk them because they were frauds. I also have a background and perform in magic and mentalism, have for many, many years, mostly focused on psychic entertainment these days. So I have a knowledge base for that. But we don't go into debunk because the average person may be mistaken, and we explain, but we don't debunk. Because as soon as you say, part of what we're doing is to debunk your experience, people who know what that word means will be very put off and maybe even hostile towards you at that point, right? We explain. So TV has rarely portrayed the way that we actually do investigations. There have been segments going back to the 1960s on occasion where kind of it's a highlights reel of what's been portrayed, what we do in investigation. But even so, even before night shot cameras, when I was doing segments for TV shows back in the 1980s rather, and even the early 90s, there were oftentimes the director or producer on site would say, hey, let's do this at night because it's spookier and it looks cooler on TV. Can we turn out the lights or turn down the lights? In other words, they want to set atmosphere. We can get some of what's correct there, and really the idea is to try to get as much good information out. But it doesn't matter whether it's a news piece or a reality TV show. Television does not give full disclosure on what's actually going on from an investigative perspective, and even often from the experience perspective of the people who are being worked with. So what's reality TV? Well, reality TV got its real first bump in the 1980s with the, I think it was 1988, if I recall, 88 or 86, 88 I think it was, the Writers Guild strike that shut down TV production. And the networks, this is, remember, at the very, very beginnings of cable TV. There had been sort of reality shows, if you want to call the documentaries and other things about sharks. You know, Discovery Channel was doing Shark Week in the mid 80s. They're still doing Shark Week. Hence the popularity of the Sharknado movies. I guess sharks are really popular. Reality TV is unscripted television. All right, so unscripted does not mean candid. It does not mean real. It often doesn't even mean documentary. And even documentaries can be produced with a bias or slant on them. They're not always as is, as things are real. Unscripted is unscripted, meaning they don't involve a writer per se to write a screenplay or teleplay, or even necessarily anything detailed at all. But, let me just stick with here for a second. But there is direction. There's direction and there's editing. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as we go through here. All right, so paranormal reality TV has spawned thousands of ghost hunting groups. One of my students in 2015, for a course she was doing in college, a sociology course, she did a survey going to websites all over the U.S. websites for U.S.-based ghost hunting teams that were active. And she stopped counting at 3,000. Many of those had started in an area where there was one ghost hunting group, and then people split off because they didn't like there were interpersonal issues, or they wanted to do it their own way, or they got bored with the guy who was running it. But one group can spawn, I saw in one instance myself in the Sacramento area, and actually in Seattle too, like one group turns into 50 groups, which has kind of shut down a bunch of them since then. But people see things on TV that they can do that seem exciting because people are interested in the paranormal, and they're able to do it because the people on those shows are plumbers, people with no scientific background, all sorts of other folks. They're just normal guys, normal women. Okay, so anybody can do it. That's the message of paranormal reality TV, with no knowledge whatsoever. Oh, I've been doing it for 30 years. Yeah, but have you been doing it right for 30 years? Have you doing it with knowledge for 30 years? That doesn't help if you're not collecting things and understanding what's actually going on. So it's easy to follow these, but I would contend that, unlike a cooking show where you can follow along, because they have to show things more or less the way they are. They still do editing on those cooking shows even. Of course, they have to do editing for time, if nothing else. But they don't typically leave any steps out or cut out things when, they do cut out stuff like dead air where people just waiting around for something to happen. What's good about these shows is people come out of the woodwork and express their interest publicly, which was not the case through the mid-1990s, really. I think Sightings and Unsolved Mysteries were two shows that really got people start thinking about this. Before that, it was In Search Of back in the 70s that got people kind of interested in this stuff. But actually in the 1970s, because of books and other things, people were able to talk about this a lot more than even today with the reality TV, because reality TV focuses on ghost hunting. That's what's good about it. But, here's what actually happens. There's a show idea. We're doing a show investigating ghosts and hauntings and things like that. Okay. So the production company pitches an idea. It is the network, whether it's a streaming network, whether it's a bigger production company, whether it's an actual broadcast network, and it's rarely actual broadcast cable network, something like that. They actually buy the show. They basically say, yes, go ahead and do a pilot. Or we're going to buy a season of the show. Okay. And they give then they give you some direction. So in other words, the show proposal may not be what ends up on the air because the network executives, I'm sure you've all heard about network executives or film executives screwing around with the show or the film, which makes it often worse a lot of times. That's why there are director's cuts, by the way, for films. So the production company has an idea, and there could be other network directives. I met with one production company here in the Bay Area years ago that had been doing a lot of work. I had actually worked with them on a couple of one-off shows for one of the cable networks. And they wanted to do a ghost hunting show, but they wanted to do it right. And so I had, one of the things they wanted, which was a network directive, was a diverse group. So yes, I had a racially diverse set of people who were working with us and my team, local team. One of whom they wanted an attractive. They actually said, we need somebody who's pretty. They wanted a woman on the team who was pretty. I had a former model who was one of my students at JFK University. And they wanted a psychic. So I had a couple psychics I tossed to them, both of whom were exceptionally good psychics as well. When otherwise we were racially diverse. So we got that. They like it. They're talking to another group, as it turns out. And they turned our group down because the other group's psychic was younger and prettier than our psychic. And the network they couldn't actually find the psychic the network wanted. The network wanted a 20-something, blonde, blue-eyed, really pretty psychic. And my former model was not blonde or blue-eyed, and she wasn't 20-something, but she was very good looking. Not enough. They wanted the psychic to be that way. So they went with a group that had a late 20s blonde, blue-eyed psychic who was very attractive, and they never bought the show. They did a pilot. Show didn't go well. They didn't buy the show. That's a network directive, that kind of thing. We hear that quite a bit, that the networks want certain types of people. They want to cast the shows, essentially. That's just the starting point. If you're actually making the show, there's direction by the director or producer, whoever's on location. So ever wonder in some of those shows that they're exploring the underground, underneath the city? They've discovered an underground city under under Rome, things like that. Or maybe there's a cave somewhere, and you hear the person who's investigating, who's the host, who's talking about going into a chamber or to a cave. I'm going to be the first human being in this chamber since it was sealed up by the Romans in the early, around 200 AD. All right. And then it shows him going towards the opening. And it cuts to him coming into the opening, saying the same thing. I can't believe I'm the first person in here. Right now, maybe he was the first person in there, but that's not what the shot shows me, because unless the Romans left a camera guy there who's still alive, how is that camera showing a person coming into the cave, into the chamber? Right? They play with the reality. I have done many shows. Some were news shows, some of the magazine shows, some of the TV shows like Unsolved Mysteries and Sightings. I've done a few of the reality shows here and there. And the director or producer says things like, okay, that was really a good take, but do me a favor, Loyd, can you go back out and come into the room? But as you're coming in, come in much slower and look around like you're noticing something. Or they'll ask me a question during an interview. I'll give an answer. Okay, can you give me another version of that answer, but stretch it out? Now do another version where it's much, much shorter. Can you do a version which is talking about X, Y, or Z? So in other words, they're directing what's on camera. And that's guaranteed going on with the talent that you see in these ghost hunting groups. But then ultimately you have editing. So you could have, I actually had, I think it was Jason Hawes, wasn't Grant, I think it was Jason, at one of the presentations I saw at a conference. He mentioned that, they shoot like 30 or 35 hours on location, which gets edited down to 22 minutes. That's pretty normal. I mean, I shot a 10-hour day for a segment years ago for a TV show in 1984, which is actually on my YouTube channel. And in that 10 hours, it cut down to 4.5 minutes. So this is like shooting a movie. You'll shoot for weeks and weeks and weeks, and you get maybe 2-hour movie out of it, but you pick the best take, all of that. I was cut out of an Unsolved Mysteries show because I refused to say what the director wanted me to say, which was contrary to what I thought was going on in the case, completely contrary to what was going on in the case. So these producers are trying to get ratings. They're trying to produce something that hopefully people will watch and continue to watch and come back again and again for ratings. That's how they get advertisers. Nothing to do with portraying reality whatsoever. If you think Real Housewives, any of the Real Housewives, are candid shows, rather than maybe they did have a fight, but it wasn't a big enough fight, so they shoot it again and ask people to overact, to play it up, or do something different. Reality TV is not reality. It's unscripted, but it is directed and edited. One of the things about our field, and this has always been the case prior to the proliferations of cable TV, really, and then eventually streaming, is that most of the time you would see segments on different shows on ghosts and things at Halloween during October. That's pretty much it. And it was always be spooky, because Halloween's spooky. So it's always been that reality TV focuses on spooky. And once night shot cameras became available commercially, that made things spookier. And that's the only reason investigations are done in the dark for television, because they have night shot camera. Without a night shot camera, you could not shoot in the dark. The lights would be on. And in fact, we don't investigate in the dark unless that is the only condition under which people experience something. We will also investigate with the lights on to see if there's a normal explanation, because people do not perceive things well. Living people don't perceive the reality of what's going on well, the environment, when the lights are out. The majority of people, the vast majority of people, 99.999% of people who have ghostly experiences have them throughout the day, early morning, late at night, but the lights are on, or it is daylight. Ghosts do not suddenly show up just in the dark. Right now, and because of the need for ratings, and also because some of the ghost hunting groups themselves buy into this, it spawned and resurfaced old folklore and supported the folklore. So here's some examples of paranormal folklore. Ghosts are mainly or exclusively found in the dark. Absolutely untrue based on the hundreds of thousands of experiences of apparitions and hauntings that people have recorded for the last 140 plus years. Ghosts need heat or other energy to manifest. That comes from phony spiritualists in the early 20th century. That's where that comes from. There are not cold spots per se. People feel cold, but when you look at temperature differences, it's very rare to have an actual temperature difference in that cold spot. You can feel a temperature difference, but you can't measure it because it's not a physical thing. It's a psychological thing. There's no manifesting here. This is an ESP thing. There's no need to pull energy together. Ghosts don't need energy per se at all. The battery thing is still a really interesting thing. It's not an energetic thing because it's not consistent. I know batteries we've had experiences with batteries draining, and interestingly enough, a few minutes later, they suddenly are full again. So clearly the energy hasn't been taken from them. Technology, there's a folklore that technology can detect ghosts. The more tech, the better. That's not true. Again, we don't know what we're trying to detect. We're detecting the environment, and if there's enough information connecting or correlating to people's experiences, we can say that we can certainly infer that maybe these readings indicate something weird's in the environment, but it's the experience that says it's an apparition or a haunting. So technology is not more important than people's experiences. A good EVP is not proof of anything because you can't prove that it came from a spirit. It also could have been you, or it might not even really be an actual EVP, communication from a spirit. You don't even know there's a spirit there. Most EVPs, nobody's sensing a spirit at the time the EVP's being picked up. The idea that places where tragedy struck are good places to find ghosts, that is ghost story folklore 101 from all over the world. Just like cemeteries are where you find ghosts. Not true. If you were dead, do you want to be hanging out in the cemetery with your decaying body? That makes literally no sense. Ghosts are often evil or demonic. Okay. So you die, you become a ghost, you suddenly turn evil or demonic. Ghosts are people too. The ones who are bullies in life, who are hanging around, they're still bullies. The ones who are a-holes in life are still a-holes. People do not become evil or demonic because they die. They might be pissed off at the world because they die, but they're not evil or demonic. Shadow figures, first of all, in night shot cameras, you can get shadows because the night shot camera itself has a spotlight. It's an infrared spotlight. And just because it's dark doesn't mean it's evil or demonic. Right behind here, I have an action figure of the shadow, as in who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men. Dressed all in black. Not evil. Fighting evil. In fact, I'd rather have a shadowy figure that's cool, if I put my hand in it, than a really, really bright light that's blinding to me, or hot. And the idea that a scientific approach includes a demonologist makes no sense whatsoever, because demonology is not a science, it's religion, and it's only religion-based. Right? Paranormal activity, reality TV, they've talked to us. They don't want us around most of the time because we're not going to buy in to whatever the story is that they're trying to tell, which is usually to make things evil or bad. I know for a fact that several people who have been on some of the paranormal shows as clients have gotten very upset. One in particular who fortunately did not sign a release form. They forgot to have her sign it. She had a friendly ghost, and she had kind of a spot in her house that had maybe some bad energy. And a particular show folks went in, and when it aired, they made the whole story of her ghost, her friendly ghost, evil, demonic, the whole bit, and they made up a whole bunch of other evidence to tell a story. She was not happy, and she talked a lot about it. And we've seen this happen in a lot of places. I've gotten calls from a couple of shows that I refused to even consider working with because the opening of the show is, there is evil here. Whatever is going to happen, it's going to be bad. There's another show where the psychic always finds something evil in the place, and they've wanted to work with a couple of the locations that I have had a lot of experience with. One of those locations actually brought me into the discussion because they didn't know what to do. And the reality is I turned them down because this was a friendly ghost. It's a working restaurant. There's no point in doing a show where suddenly the psychic says there's something evil here, which might keep customers away. So they don't want actual parapsychologists in these cases not because we can't be good on camera, but because we're going to not play the game that they want to play. And when I've worked with production companies that really had everything positive at heart, because the network asked for something different, and we've provided a really good dramatic, something that would be as dramatic but not negative as some of those negative demonic shows, they decided to go the other way with the shows like the other ones because they knew that they were likely to get better ratings. Last thing here, ethics. What's the most important thing for doing an investigation? Yes, it is getting evidence. You want evidence, you want to understand the phenomena, but somebody calls you for help. So this is different than public places. Residential cases, if somebody calls you for help, that should be number one on your hit parade. Helping the clients should be number one. That includes figuring out what's happening or why something's happening. That includes getting evidence, but those things are not the focus. The why will lead to the help. Getting the evidence is less important than understanding what's actually going on so you can help the living people, sometimes the dead in the case. That's an ethical behavior. It's our ethical mandate. Another reason we don't work with some TV production companies. All right, and just so you know, investigations can harm people, because if you are asked for help and you just show them or tell them that you found that they have something evil in their house, or yes, your house is haunted, and you walk away when they've asked you for help and understanding, or even hopefully resolving, they may be more rattled than when you came in to begin with. And that actually can be more damning. Saying that some activity in their home, which is benign, is demonic, can scare people more and cause more damage than the activity itself. So what do you need to know? You should know something about the history of investigations and research. It's not like it's a secret. There's a lot of sources out there. That's one of the things I can send you, is how to get some of those sources. You should know something about ESP and PK and survival-related experiences that we found out in our field investigations of people, but also in the lab. Especially the lab findings are ESP and PK, and now we have research with mediums as well. You should know a little bit about science itself. And we do have online classes at the Rhine Center. This is one of the reasons why I would send out the slides. There are a number of organizations that have lots of information on their websites for free. But I would say always to start with the Psi Encyclopedia, which is from the Society for Psychical Research. That's an easy, free resource. Think of it as Wikipedia for the paranormal. And stay away from Wikipedia, by the way, because that's so biased against our field that it makes no sense to go there. But all these organizations have a ton of free information you can get as well. You can even join the Forever Family Foundation for free if you want to. We have some upcoming courses for the Rhine Center starting the first full week of May, most of them. There is an introduction to parapsychology, an overview class. You can take them in any order, by the way. You don't need to take the intro first unless you're going. And if you're going for a certificate, eventually you'll have to take it. But one of my former students, Jimmy Aiken, who has a great podcast out there, Jimmy is teaching the introduction to parapsychology course that I developed. There's a course on life after death, the evidence for life after death. That's survival studies, human consciousness. I'm also teaching a seminar on looking at different cultures and how they experience the paranormal and psychic phenomena. And then I have the 4-week class starting in mid-May on developing your intuition. The other are all 8-week classes. John Kruth is doing a class on psychology and psi. It's not about determining if people are crazy or counseling, but it is looking at how psychology plays into understanding people's experiences in general. I do an every other week Q&A on YouTube myself. The next one is coming up this Sunday night. It's youtube.com/@AskProfessorParanormal. All the previous sessions have been recorded live. It's a 1-hour session. So every other week's the 14th and the 28th are coming up. And then again, send me an email if you would like the slides. You would like a resource guide that I have with links to organizations and free information on the web from credible sources, including some X or Twitter accounts to follow, good YouTube channels with great video about the field that's really accurate and coming from colleagues of mine as well. And these are my books. So let me go ahead and switch over now. And that's all she wrote.
Okay, I think we lost Philip, but oh my goodness, I couldn't keep up with the notes, so I'm going to have you send me the slides.
Okay, sure.
So, but yeah, and usually with me, I come up with questions after the fact, but I can reach out to you if I can think of anything. But
yeah, and let me say that if people do have questions, they can use that email. It's also there right there on the slide there.
okay.
Just send me an email. I might not get to it like within a couple of days, because if I get too many, right now I am busy grading. I think I have, I don't know, 50 some odd final quizzes for some of the classes. By the way, the classes for the Rhine Center, you can take for a grade if you're going for a certificate, or you can just take them for fun.
Oh.
And it used to be that at least half the students were taking them for fun. Yeah, the last sessions that I did, everybody wanted a grade.
Yeah.
So I'm a little overwhelmed with grading. So it might be a couple of weeks before I get back to you. But the one thing I can do is, as soon as I get an email asking for the slides and resource lists, I can send that right out.
Okay, perfect. And I'll make sure I get your email and everything up. And I did do a couple screenshots of your contact information, so I'll make sure I get that on our page as well. And hopefully, Philip just messaged me. He says it's storming, so we will see him soon. Hopefully he comes back on. But we did have 2 questions during the show. And if anyone has any other questions, please feel free to put them in the comments and we will get to them. And I think you might have answered this a little bit, but just to be sure, Bob wants to know, he was at an investigation recently and asked Spirit Box SB7 a question of what my cat's name was and got an immediate response with the correct answer. How would a spirit know that answer to his question without having ESP?
Well, it might not have been a spirit. One of the things we know from laboratory, this is why you need to know about laboratory research. We have a huge amount of data that shows that human beings can affect random systems, living human beings. So I guess we assume that dead people can too. But the problem is that living people being able to affect random systems unconsciously means that the operators might be affecting spirit boxes unconsciously. Obviously, if it was, whether it was, the thing is, if it was a radio wave, if it was a radio scanner type, rather than the type that comes up with words from its data bank, if it was a radio scanner, either the ESP of the ghost or your ESP would have had to have known that there was the name of the cat was coming up on some radio station. Because otherwise, how would the right word have been chosen?
Right.
And that's the thing with the fact is that it's not just PK. ESP is involved even in almost all PK experiences. If when people are moving things with their mind, consciously or unconsciously, how you move it is an ESP thing. And let's say that you're not even, it's not even in sight of you. Something moves behind you and you're the poltergeist agent. You have to have used a little targeting. Your targeting opportunity is ESP as well.
Yeah, that's always been something that I've been always interested in, is that the responses you get, whether it's an EVP, digital voice recorder, video, or anything like that, is not what the spirit is answering, but it's actually what you think the answer should be.
Right. So again, it could be you. I've talked to some ghost hunting groups and they tell me that somebody in their group always gets EVP, and that makes me very suspicious that they're unconscious. That person is causing the EVP, or they got a friendly ghost that's just following them around and screwing with them all the time. It's the same spirit.
Right.
That's why having a human being to say there's a spirit here is helpful. But there's the knowledge base. It could actually be that we unconsciously work, or the spirit actually works with us unconsciously as well. So
okay, and then Philip's back. You're on mute, Philip.
We just had a storm come out of nowhere. The electricity just started going off and on, so my internet went out. Sorry about that.
That's okay. We're just catching up on the questions. And one last question was, Amelia wanted to know, what does it mean when your family members come to you in your dreams? Why would my aunt tell me, your mama and I want you to come with us? She was very happy. Both she and her mom have passed. And she also dreamt about her mom, dad, grandmother, and they are also well. They aren't sick and always happy.
So those would be called visitation dreams. There are a couple of reasons that a dream like that might happen. One is if a spirit is actually visiting you. And really that dream should have, the thing about psychic dreams, I wrote a book on psychic dreaming. And psychic dreams have a very, very different feel to them. So when you wake up, you just know it wasn't just a dream about family. It felt different than any other dream you've had about your family. It felt much more real. Now, the come with us, though, could actually be not come to them like die and come to us. It also could be that you need to come to something about them. That would be, there's a method of programming your dreams called dream incubation, where if you want to get an answer like this, and it may take several nights, but you basically as you're going to sleep, you tell yourself, and it can be out loud or just in your head, I will dream about my family and ask them where they want me to come with them. And they will tell me. I will remember that dream. So in other words, you think, or this is the idea of sleeping on something. You think about what you want to dream about. You're basically programming yourself. And maybe the answer is coming from them. Maybe the answer is coming from your unconscious. It doesn't matter either way. You're going to get an answer that might be illuminating. I'm clear about that.
And then I actually have one question that I've been meaning to ask you ever since we've had you on the show in the past with all of the topics that you talk about is, what are your thoughts on the Philip experiment?
Okay, well, first, let me say that the Philip experiment, really, really interesting, based on the psychology of psychokinesis principles that Kenneth Batcheldor came up with in the 1960s. He was a psychologist in Great Britain. And honestly, these principles just really interesting that they kind of relate to sports psychology too, to any performance psychology. With psychokinesis, there's something called witness inhibition. And that is that in our culture, if you were to see something floating through the air, odds are you would, unless you were a paranormal investigator, you would pretty much say, I didn't really see that. I certainly would admit to anybody else that I saw that. So we're inhibited from even witnessing things. And actually, our perceptions are such that when somebody doesn't believe in something, they may not even see it, even if it's happening right in front of their face. Certainly won't hear it. I think most teenagers, it's usually one or the other parent is yelling for them right outside the door, and they don't hear. They say they don't hear the parent. They're actually not hearing the parent. Their ears are hearing the parent, but their perception is blocking that parent out completely. So that's one thing. Then the other is something called ownership resistance. That when you do psychokinesis or try to make something move, the idea that your mind can do that is really a problem for a lot of people to accept. I have done many workshops in psychokinesis, getting people to move little targets that kind of spin on a spindle, also under glass. And I get a lot of people to do it. And then I see once in a while, there'll be someone who sees it and then their eyes get wide and they back up. It's like, oh, and they can't do it again. So the idea of the Philip experiment was to put all the blame for any of the activity on a non-existent entity. All right. And they did a backstory for a guy named Philip. The only thing that was accurate or real was the castle that they chose in England that he supposedly lived in. They made everything up. And then they sat down not with the lights out. They didn't have to do that. And they tried to have Philip do things, and they kind of did some of the old spiritualist stuff to call on the spirits and all that, call on Philip. And eventually they started getting raps on the table. What's really interesting, there's a video on, if you look at Philip experiment on YouTube, there's one video where they're in a TV studio and they take a card table and they put it upside down so it's flat on the floor, and they're still getting raps, which doesn't happen in any other way. It's not like they can do the raps from underneath at that point. So because everything that happened was Philip's fault, nobody had to take responsibility for it. And therefore it continued for quite some time. And there have been other sitter groups, and actually the whole idea of a spoon bending party is based on the same principle, that you get people to get out of their own way, to act goofy. And yeah, if the spoon flops over, you can always claim it's your strength, and maybe sometimes it is. But I've done a number of successful spoon bending parties, and we have some really interesting bending happening. And in one case, and by the way, I tend to buy really, really cheap spoons that are more likely to break when you bend them with force than anything else. We had one where there was a stand-up comic there, brought by one of my students, a friend of his, and she had us all laughing so much that just about everybody was bending all over the place. And at the end, she says, "Does anybody ever unbend?" So we're all chanting at her to unbend, and she literally takes these tightly wound spoons and she just straightens them out, 2 fingers like that. So it's a situation where we have to get out of our own way. We can't doubt. We can't think about what's going on. That's what happens in sports psychology. Somebody second guesses themselves and they can't perform anymore. And actually, test taking. If you think you can't do something, you can't do something. So it's all a very sound psychological principle here.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then real quick, the book you mentioned about dreams.
It's called Psychic Dreaming.
Okay.
And that's what it's about.
Okay, perfect. Philip, we have about 10 minutes left. Did you have any questions?
Yeah, a couple. Going back to EVPs, is it possible that it's easier for an apparition to embed an EVP on certain devices rather than other devices? Saying that because we've gotten EVPs on some cameras, not on other cameras, not on some digital recorders, but on some others, all at the same time in response to some questions. So they seem to be direct answers.
So let me ask you, so you're getting different devices in the same session, right?
Yes.
Okay. So we're going to assume that it's the same entity that's doing it at that point. It may be that it is easier in some ways for certain devices. One of the interesting things about psychokinesis is trying to detect it in a laboratory when something is moving. So even those targets being moved, if there's 5 different ways in physics to cause that object to move, you can detect one time and another time and another time. So it's like whatever's the path of least resistance in that moment. That seems to be how PK works. It also could be that entity has an affinity for, oh, I like that camera.
Yeah. Okay.
I like this device. Humans, ghosts are people too.
And let's talk about tactile experiences. I've been touched. I've had whispering in my ear. So is this PK? How are they doing this?
Right.
So actually feel like I'm feeling it.
Right. So remember that your sense of touch is one of the 5 senses.
Yes.
And we get a perception of being touched without being touched. Mm-hmm. So I have been touched also in a couple of cases on the USS Hornet. Yeah. And in one instance, I had calmed down the host. I was doing a segment for Popular Mechanics for Kids, and the host was 14. And he had seen a ghost in the back galley and come running out, and he's a little freaked out because he's seen one of the apparitions there. And I'm calming him down. The camera guy's about 6 feet behind us, so it's got my back and the kid host in frame. And I was wearing a fairly loose windbreaker, and as I calmed the kid down, I get a pat on the back. So I turned to the camera guy and asked, "Did my jacket move?" And my jacket didn't move.
Interesting.
And I'm pretty sure that my shirt didn't move. And it wasn't a psychokinetic touch. It was actually a perception of a touch in that way.
I love it. Just want to end on a weird note, though. Have you ever discussed with any colleagues about, we say that apparitions don't have a body. Is it possible that they're in a dimension we can't see and they do have a body? And, we see animals reacting to things we can't see. Maybe they're there and we can't see them. Is that ever something you've discussed with anyone?
Yeah, I mean, it's been discussed. Frankly, animals look often. There's a lot of reasons animals look like they're looking at something would have nothing to do with it. And then animals might be sensitive to hauntings also. Yeah. So they might be picking that up, not necessarily a spirit in any way, shape, or form. And animals have ESP also. So just like certain people might see or hear or some other experience, certain animals might have an experience like that as well. The other dimension thing is really difficult to determine because they are clearly affecting our physical world.
Yes.
So it might be a dimension in which there are some physicists say there are 11 dimensions. Others talk about 27 dimension or 29 dimensions, mathematically described, not proven. We know that there are 4 dimensions, and there might be others, but it doesn't, until we know something more about consciousness and what it is,
yes,
we don't really know whether dimensionality has anything to do with it at all. And the other question is why would they have clothing on? And do they shop in that other dimension?
maybe some great stores, good bargains. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, we don't hear that there's money there. So in the afterlife, one of the important things that we get from the mediums is that the apparitions that we're talking about haven't gone to the other side. Whatever that is, that's probably a higher dimension or something else.
Yeah,
the ones that we're investigating, that we're dealing with, are people who are here in the physical world still. Mm-hmm. So and even the best mediums make a distinction in that way.
Yes, I mean, they come to me in their 20s and 30s and may have died in their 80s, but that's when they were at their best, and that's the way they want to be remembered.
Yeah, that's the way they think of themselves. So
yeah,
so everybody knowing that means that if you think of yourself looking much, much better looking than you actually are, you can probably be seen that way.
Yeah, I'll be in my 30s when I come back.
Yeah, I'm going to be about 30, but I'm going to add more hair to my head. Yeah, for sure.
I could talk about this stuff all night. I just love it.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay, I'm going to pull up your screen one more time with the books that you had. Okay. And all of your contact information. So if anyone wants to reach out to you, all the information is there. And I will make sure I get that up on our Facebook page tomorrow as well.
Great.
So that people
great.
know how to get a hold of you. But thank you again for being on the show today. As always, it's very educational, and I take lots of notes.
Thank you. Well, and I hope to see folks in some of the classes at the Rhine Center.
Yes, yeah, definitely. It's been on my list for a couple years now.
You got a long list, Heather. You got to move that one up a bit, though.
I know. Now that I'm working and not relying on book sales, I can do it. But again, thank you everybody for watching us tonight. I'm super excited as always to have you guys here. Like we had mentioned earlier in the show, we have some amazing news and amazing things happening with Ghost Education 101 over the next couple months. So make sure you follow us on Facebook at Ghost Education 101. Always watch the replay today by subscribing to our YouTube channel, also Ghost Education 101. And then you can catch us live every other week on YouTube, Parallax TV, on Facebook. So make sure you guys do that. And I know we had rescheduled this earlier in the year, but we will be returning in 2 weeks for our panel discussion about women of the paranormal. And that is going to include myself, Alex Matsuo, and Sin Schrader Hill. Katie Foreman did message me. She is having, I think, a procedure done, and she's not going to be able to make it. But we will have the 3 of us on in 2 weeks to discuss women in the paranormal. So anything else you guys want to say before we wrap things up?
Professor Paranormal, are you on YouTube now? Did I just read that?
Yes. So I have an every other week Ask Professor Paranormal session. Next one's coming up this Sunday night, 8:30 Eastern, 5:30 Pacific. It's youtube.com/@Ask Professor Paranormal.
Yes. And that's interactive. Ask questions.
Yep. That is interactive. It's all Q&A. I don't like to lecture. I prefer to actually answer questions.
Excellent.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Perfect. Yep. So that is it for tonight. We will see you guys in 2 weeks, and Loyd will definitely be in contact to get you back on the show again in the future.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Good night, everybody.
Have a great night.
Good night.